Chapter 31, The only easy day was yesterday. Ichigo let out a yawn as he sat on the massive back of Bawabawa, the worm-like hollow pet of Pesh and Dondo Chaka, whom they had allowed him to borrow for faster transportation across the sands of Hueco Mundo. And thank goodness for that, because the world of the hollows was absolutely huge. Huge, but oh so crushingly boring. The novelty of being inside of the home world of the spirit-devouring beasts, the hollows, wore off very quickly once he had been there for long enough. And long enough was longer than 24 hours, as it was now deep within day 2. Ugh! Ichigo groaned before letting out a forced yawn. Everything in this goddamn dimension looks the goddamn same. He was now sorely wishing that he had figured to bring someone else. Even hearing Yuria bitch about the trip and Ichigo's intent in Hueco Mundo would have been better than listening to the wind howl and Bawabawa grunt unintelligibly in response to the things he'd say every now and again. Still, knowing that there was another living creature around was somewhat reassuring for Ichigo, who was currently holding onto a spirit ribbon that he'd felt out as Naruto's. His was the easiest to locate because aside from Tatsuki's it was the one he was most familiar with currently in Hueco Mundo, and Naruto's Ryatsu's signature dwarfed hers on her best day and his worst. It still didn't stop it from being the dullest thing he'd ever done in his life. All there was to look at was sand dune, dead-looking tree with no leaves on it, sand dune, weird dead skeleton, sand dune. And that was it. He wasn't there for the scenery though. Kurosaki Ichigo was a proactive kind of guy, and he didn't feel the need to sit and wait in the pocket for the enemy to come to him when he knew where to go to pop them in the mouth. Or cut them with his Zanpakuto in this case. Hey, he invaded the Seriidii and brought 2 of its strongest captains down in an effort to save Rukia, didn't he? This was kind of like the same thing, only he didn't have to worry about escaping safely with someone this time. He'd trained for all of that time to learn to properly utilize his hollow mask to augment his powers. Well, it was time to put that to use and shove it down Aizen's throat. Suddenly, Bawabawa stopped moving and started coughing. That wasn't good. Was he sick? Did hollows even get sick? Either way, Bawabawa was hacking up a storm. So much so that Ichigo jumped off of his back and rested a hand on his side. What's wrong, big guy? Did you swallow too much sand or something? He stopped his train of thought to jump onto another. Do you even eat sand? I remember hearing something about you not being able to live without it. There was no way for Bawabawa to answer, not until he cleared his throat. Something he did with a mighty set of coughs that allowed him to spit out what seemed to be several heavy metal balls. While the large hollow worm took deep breaths now that his airway was cleared, Ichigo gave him a deadpan stare. You ate gigantic metal balls? That was just dumb. Even for an associate of Dondo Chaka and Pesh, what the hell? At that moment the metal balls began to merge into one and a strange green rune appeared on them before there was a bright flash that blinded Ichigo and Bawabawa. When it cleared and he could see again, Ichigo caught sight of someone that he hadn't seen in a while, and someone whose presence he was completely unaware of due to the fact that on his own he couldn't sense their race. Koga-san? The orange mohawk and the stubbly beard. The tall, muscular frame. Yes, it was the surviving Bount that had become a member of Equilibrium in the wake of the final battle in Karakura town. And he had just been spit out by a hollow worm. Because that was normal and everything. With a sigh, Koga mulled his metal orb around in the sand before wiping it off on his shirt. Sorry, Doc. Koga apologized to his doll for what he had to do to get there. With that done he turned to Ichigo with a stoic look on his face. Kurosaki-san. Ichigo just stood pointing between him and Bawabawa, unable to come up with the words that he wanted to say. So he had to settle. Why? Because Yorichi-sama requested that I come along to advise you if need be. And she pulled him from an ongoing assignment overlooking the occult in Tokyo for it too. Naruto was going to be pissed when he found out that Yorichi had done that, but Koga was quite certain she could make him forget if need be. With a twitching eye, Ichigo palmed his forehead. I told her I didn't need an escort. I'm not an escort, I'm an advisor, like I said. Koga said, still looking at the young man sternly. You must know just how completely foolish this is, coming to Hueco Mundo alone. Maybe, Ichigo said, shifting his Zanpakuto on his back, about as foolish as plotting to destroy the Seriidii with a handful of bounce. Let's just get going already. XXX. With Naruto's group, elsewhere in Hueco Mundo, Tatsuki had done admirably in regards to keeping pace with the more supernatural warriors than herself. They had been running at a steady pace for a day and it had taken 20 hours for her to finally drop out. It was one hell of a time for an impromptu test, but as her instructor he had to use the circumstances available to him. Naruto had no problem scooping his student up piggyback and carrying her the rest of the way though. This entire trip was making him incredibly proud of her. She'd risen to the occasion of coming to terms with the afterlife after seeing the Soul Society, doing battle against a foe that was superior to her in combat capability, and keeping up with people with serious conditioning without complaining once. Even when her legs finally quit on her, she didn't say a word. No one but him stopped for her, and even then all he did was just wordlessly pick her up and carry on, catching up with the others and falling back in step with them. She didn't fight it either. She just nestled her head on his shoulder and shut her eyes. "You alright, sweetheart?" Naruto asked the girl on his back, still running along with Gaara, Nell, and Kensei. "You want to try and get some sleep while we're just moving?" "No sensei, I'm fine." Tatsuki didn't want to look any weaker in front of all of those people so much stronger than her. She was already towing that line by allowing herself to be carried, but her legs felt too heavy for her to keep up with them any longer. "I could use a bit of a pick-me-up with one of those food pills things though." "The soldier pills? You took 2 while we were running," Naruto pointed out, keeping his eyes ahead of them on the image of Las Noches that finally seemed to be getting bigger as they kept running toward it. "Those aren't the kinds of things you want to overdo it on. You'll fry your system for life." Fry the internal energy system that she'd just learned how to use not even a few months ago? No thanks. She'd wait and rest up the natural way. She hadn't had free use of her chakra for long enough to try pushing what she could do with it yet. "Are we there yet?" Tatsuki muttered questioningly through the fabric of Naruto's clothes after readjusting her head on his shoulder to get comfortable. "No." Gaara deadpanned, sort of wishing that he was Tatsuki's sensei too after seeing the rapport develop between her and Naruto. Unfortunately, he couldn't teach her most of what made him an awesome shinobi in life, so it wouldn't have been productive. Stupid Naruto and his stupid Rinnegan, which made him uber jutsu compatible. While Gaara had been dead and sleeping as a hollow, he'd probably forgotten more about the ninja arts than he remembered right now. "Speaking of which, Naruto, what was the last enemy that made you go all out, not counting the Jubi?" Gaara asked with his normal expressionless look on his face. That question didn't interest just Gaara. Neliel and Kensei both looked over to the yellow-haired ringleader to see what he would say. He'd fought captains, so he was going to say one of them, wasn't he? "I couldn't tell you. Jubi Sasuke is the only one I trained for until recently. The sole purpose for existing was to keep him back," Naruto said, brow furrowing in thought. "The more power I use, the easier it is for him to wake up sooner, and I've had to dig into the coffers more in the last 6 months than I have since the last time we had our little tiff over the fate of the living world." Kensei already knew about the cataclysmic being in his belly. The impact of learning such a thing about someone kind of wore down when you then spent the next week tagging in and out of kicking his ass. But he remembered what the power looked like, sheer colored power covering his entire body, and that Naruto had shown it to them and even used it to fight more of them at once for a time on the first day. He'd actually been handling them all quite well, almost enough to entice Kensei, Shinji, Love, and Rose into respectively busting out Bankai instead of just Shirkai and their masks to fight him. That was until he abruptly cut it off without warning and they started fighting more evenly with him, some of them even getting the better of him in some instances. "Wait, you're telling me that using the monster's power makes it wake up faster?" Kensei asked with a twitching eye of seething anger. Punching him in the stomach felt appropriate at the moment. "Why the fuck were you training against us with it then?" "Because I didn't know that was what it was until recently. I practiced it with you because I didn't know if I'd have to use it in the Seriidii or not, and I didn't want to go in cold," Naruto defended loudly before quieting down quickly. Tatsuki was trying to sleep right behind him. But that was what it was though. He'd had his powwow with Gaara and Haiden about the Jubi, and soon thereafter had come to the conclusion that using the Jubi cloak was like poking at a hibernating bear. There was no guarantee that it'd wake up that easily from such a deep sleep, but it was more than possible to rouse it. Either way, he'd explained his stance. He'd prepared for the worst because he had still been rather unnerved at the prospect of fighting an army of Shinigami at the time. Old superstitions and all that. "If I would have had to keep fighting Yamamoto Gigi, I definitely would have had to do it though," Naruto added on in the end. "That old man fights like a prick." "And when you actually did use it against Sailaporo?" Naruto shrugged. "Me and Haiden missed our flight, Wonder Boy had me a bit miffed from earlier, and Sailaporo or whatever his name used to be was attacking Nell. I was pissed, and he was probably the most convenient and least pitiable target to vent on that I've had in a good long while. He had been Espada level strong. He had a small battalion of flunkies to throw at him. He'd been attacking a defenseless little girl under the group's care with intent to kill. That was the trifecta, and thus Naruto had no problems with mincing him up in a hurry. It only took a few moments. Thank you for that, by the way. Nell commented offhandedly, getting a small salute of a gesture from Naruto in return. Yeah, hero, blah, Kensei said, irritably squashing down the gratitude going Naruto's way in favor of getting back to their original topic at hand. How do you even use something like that? Not anywhere in Karakura town, that's for damn sure. Naruto said under his breath, grinning a bit when he heard Tatsuki snicker on his back under the guise of still trying to sleep. I'd hope the fuck not from what you say about it. You could nuke the whole place in one move. Oh stop, you're flattering me. XXX. Sometime later, Soul Society, Siriidii, 1st Division HQ, Captain's Meeting Room. The entire arrangement of the Godii 13 captains had been assembled after the fallout of the Arrancar attack on an entire 2 districts of the Soul Society that had claimed countless lives. In response to the bold movement of clearly declared war, the Siriidii had already dispatched forward teams of Shinigami comprised of members of multiple divisions to keep watch over the various Rakongai districts in the hopes of far faster response time in the future. We still don't have our own guaranteed way back out of Hueco Mundo yet. An irritated Soifan asked the resident scientist of the captains, we can't just keep sitting around and waiting for those treacherous bastards to try another scheme at picking away at us. If you're proposing that we send Shinigami into Hueco Mundo without a guaranteed way out, Kuratsuchi Mayuri said coolly scientific tone of voice, perhaps you would like to volunteer members of your division or of the Onmitsukudo for the one-way trip. Or I could cut out the middleman altogether and volunteer myself. You and your lieutenant? Soifan let out a scoff at the thought of having to take Omida Marekio with her into Hueco Mundo. I'd be better off alone. The sound of a sword stabbing into the table attracted attention to a long and extremely weathered Zanpakuto stuck there, and the man sitting there right by it. Hell, I'm in. Zaraki Kenpachi said with a rather bloodthirsty grin on his face, yanking his sword back out of the table with a jingle to the bells in his hair. That sounds like my kind of party. Of course someone such as him would enjoy being stuck in a realm full of hostile hollows after his blood. If he had access to Hueco Mundo to and from, he'd probably use it as a mandatory vacation spot for the entire 11th Division. It's too rash a course of action for the Godii 13 to take. Unohana Retz's temperate voice rang out like a bell as she chided Soifan gently. There is a reason that the Equilibrium Group is able to do such things that we are unable to, one would say with a reckless abandon. It's not so much reckless abandon as it is a difference in purpose and internal makeup. Shunsui said with a small smile on his face as he lazed in his own seat, they're not the backbone of any central government, and they have way less lame regulations in what they can do. So they've got advantages in how they can operate. But in the same vein they lack most of the resources that we have, namely manpower for one. It's amazing how they haven't stepped on our toes yet. I believe Shihuandano and Urahara-san managed to keep Uzumaki-san from doing that. Yukitake said helpfully, I'm fairly certain he doesn't care if he makes enemies beyond human comprehension judging from the first time he came to the Soul Society. He didn't say anything, but Byakuya's fingers twitched toward his Zanpakuto subtly. I'd imagine that living for over 2,000 years basically alone does get boring. We should ask Yamajiji about that. Shunsui replied cheekily for him. Both old friends got a bit of a chuckle out of that until Kamimura let out a growl that got them both to show respect once more. It wasn't a secret in the Siriidii that the canine-headed captain didn't particularly care for Naruto or any of Equilibrium due to the Soul Society infiltration, and the fact that Naruto had fought a rather destructive battle against the captain-commander of the Godii 13 before a ceasefire had been unofficially arranged with Aizen's defection. Kamimura said nothing though, instead choosing to remain silent, his tall and imposing figure towering in the background. He could see Soifan's point in wanting to actually be the one to press the attack. Her entire sense of identity as a fighter was to strike first hard enough to ensure that the enemy could not get back up. To have an enemy that could constantly afford to launch strike after strike on 2 different fronts freely without much fear of repercussions had to be something of an insult to the petite Shinigami captain. The doors to the meeting room flew open with a thud, heralding the arrival of the head of the Godii 13, and all eyes and attentions went directly to him without fail. Kenpachi even stood up out of his seat, showing just what he thought of the wizened old man Yamamoto. That he was a man with strength to be respected. He didn't say a word, slowly taking his time as he walked past everyone standing at attention for him until he reached the head of the room and turned to face them. His eyes passed over the lot of them before almost imperceptibly he nodded as if to open the floor to questions from his captains. Surprisingly, Kamimura was the first to speak. Yamamoto Soteisha, I don't understand why we aren't committing any of our own forces to the tasks we have allowed the Equilibrium organization to take. Relying on a fringe group such as that has even managed to obtain substitute Shinigami Kurosaki Ichigo as a member is a dangerous precedent. The substitute Shinigami position by itself was already controversial enough. There is a reason aside from the apparent capabilities they possess to travel between the realms. Yamamoto said, I do not trust them, of that I can assure you. How could he? 3 of the more prominent members were those that had been banished from the Soul Society in the past, but when a resource presents itself that has no problems doing battle with your enemy, it is something that should be taken advantage of. What if Uzumaki is not what he appears to be? He appeared to be an immortal human with abilities lost to time that could match Shinigami captains. As ludicrous as that sounded, it was staring them in the face, just as the revelation that the afterlife could routinely interact with the living was staring Naruto in his face. It was all a matter of who adapted to the eye-opener first and figured out what to do about it. As of now, the Seriidii still had more cards to play than he and his did by far, if it ever came to that, of course. This allows us an opportunity to observe both our enemy and a potential future threat at the same time, Yamamoto reasoned. The more information that could be gathered on both the Arrancar army and Equilibrium's more unique members without incurring any more losses of their own, the better. Today's ally could be tomorrow's enemy. As a matter of fact, that was what usually occurred. That group was full of dangerous elements. If they weren't talking about Naruto himself, it would be the 3 former high-ranking members of the Seriidii that were involved as well, and if not them, it also had a substitute Shinigami with incredible power. And the last substitute Shinigami hadn't particularly worked out so well for any involved party. But that was looking too far ahead to be considered safe. What are we going to do about the Arrancar threat? Yukitake asked, getting back to the heart of the matter, first in the human world, and now the Soul Society. Aizen is staging bolder attacks and stretching our resources thinner and thinner. By now, Aizen probably had a very good idea of just what his forces were capable of up against members of the Godii 13, and just what he could get away with. Their response time to threats both in the world of the living and in the Soul Society was now known to him. If he wanted to make a play on Karakura town for real, he probably had all of the information he needed to wage an attack with a heavy margin for success on his part. Kenpachi's rather bloodthirsty grin left no secrets regarding just what he thought of the entire thing. Come on. If they all want to fight so bad, we should really leave more guys around that want to take them up on that offer. If Karakura town's what they want, well hell, just send me there. I'll give them a warm welcome. I'm itching to get at these so-called espada. Absolutely not. Yamamoto stated firmly, much to Kenpachi's displeasure, we need all hands to prepare for a full-scale conflict. I do not have the time to let one of my captains loose on a leisure trip to pick a fight with 1 or 2 no-name Arrancar foes. You will have your chance when the real battles begin. Organize your squads. Seated officers will prepare to lead select Shinigami out into districts in the Soul Society in case of another attack. Captains, lieutenants, and all officers 5th seat and above in each division will remain in the Seriidii and will prepare accordingly for war. XXX. Hueco Mundo, with Ichigo. As he continued to get closer to Hueco Mundo, Ichigo's fingers started drumming more and more rapidly on the back of Bawabawa as the sandworm continued to carry him and Koga through the desert. It was easy to see that he was getting a touch restless, even with the reliable transportation. The fact that there was sandstorm slowly growing in intensity wasn't really helping his mood either. There was sand in his clothes and every time he shook it out more would fly in. Are you impatient for combat? Koga asked, startling Ichigo out of his trance. The man had been silent for hours. It said that the calm before a battle is worse than the actual battle itself. Ichigo smiled wryly at that. Whoever came up with that saying probably hadn't been in too many destructive or brutal encounters before dredging that one up. It's not really impatience, it's just, well, why is it always easier for guys like Aizen to attack us than it is for us to find them and get one over on them? For the most part we're caught in the position of having to respond, and I know someone like you detests that sort of position. Koga told him. While he wasn't nearly as strong as Ichigo, he'd been alive for far longer, and he'd seen and learned a lot about battle, but you should think about it this way. Aizen Sasuke has had an untold number of years to plan every move he's made thus far. To anticipate every possible response that the Seriidii could make, something that he learned of from right within their ranks at the highest possible level. And in return anyone that could stop him had only known of these things for a few months. Yeah. Come to think of it, why were they able to stop anything he did at all? He knew everything about everybody that could directly step up to fight him. He'd outmaneuvered everyone in the Siriidii so badly he'd basically lapped them all twice-fold. The only Shinigami in exile in Karakura town that wound up that way by choice was Yorichi. Urahara, Tessai, and all of the Vizards had been used and cast aside as scapegoats. Maybe they were just that awesome? But he didn't really prepare for any of us, did he? Ichigo said after taking a few minutes to think on what the wiser Koga had told him. I mean, he probably never knew at all that Getabushi had been waiting for him to pull something in Karakura town. At least not until everything that happened with Rukia and the Hugyoku. Then again, somehow Aizen had manipulated Rukia being stationed in Karakura town to begin with. So he didn't know just how much of everything that had happened was by design or just fell into line like that. But who was really expecting a bunch of Shinigami elite washouts, a bunch of human kids, some wayward Arankars, and some weird ultra-old human with archaic powers to be the wild cards that would save the world? Or 2 worlds actually. 3 if one actually believed that Aizen could possibly enter the realm of the Spirit King and take him out. All of this thinking was disrupting his concentration on trying to find the others via Naruto's spirit ribbon. This method of tracking others was advanced and difficult enough without looming and oppressive thoughts of why he was there and what this was all for weighing him down. He'd let the people that actually cared about those kinds of things ponder it all. He would locate a problem, seek it out, and kick its ass. It was always best to stick with what you knew after all. Wait. Do you hear that? Koga asked. All of the latent erasure in the air that he was in used to stunted his ability to sense for long distances out around him. Thus why Ichigo's spirit ribbon use was so valuable here. At first he thought that he was just hearing the wind. But the wind didn't sound like words. Dropping his full attention off of locating Naruto and the others with him, Ichigo heeded his traveling companion's words and started listening out himself. The wind, stop and become the calm. The sound of warring spears fills the empty castle. What the fuck was that, a magic spell incantation? No, that'd be silly. It sounded more like a kiddo. Damn it, it did sound like a kiddo. And looking up into the air, Ichigo got his confirmation of such when he saw a lot of angry yellow building up there. Move! Ichigo shouted, jumping off of Bawabawa before shoving the gigantic sandworm out of the way with a pushing front kick that knocked him yards and yards away. In the same motion, Ichigo turned back around and drew Zangetsu, holding the massive width of the large blade over his head to shield himself when he heard words that told him it was too late to try and escape the blast radius. Had a number 63, Reikuha, Way of Destruction number 63, Thunder Roar Seer. A large and concentrated strike of yellow energy bolted down from the sky in the form of a lightning strike, causing a devastating explosion. The result was a massive crater in the sand, but Ichigo remained at the bottom of it, still holding up Zangetsu defensively, only now he was in his Bankai form. That had hurt. But it would have hurt Koga and Bawabawa far worse. It probably would have killed them. That isn't all you've got, is it? Ichigo said lowly as he looked up into the air and caught sight of the figure that had attacked him through the sandstorm. It was hard to see, but it was definitely human in shape. He could only see it for a moment through the shroud of sand flying through the air before it vanished. On full alert, Ichigo turned and blocked a sword strike that sent him sliding back through the sands. Now he could finally sense the level of Ryatsu from his attacker, and it was extremely powerful. Stronger than a captain's conventional power. A situation like this is one I could not overlook. A calm collected voice said that Ichigo vaguely remembered. Through the sandstorm the human figure finally walked close enough for Ichigo to make out the dark skin, long braided purple hair, white uniform and white visor over his eyes, and Zanpakuto of Tosen Kaname. One of the traitorous captains of the Godai 13 had come out into the desert looking just for him. You came out here looking for me? Well, doesn't that make me feel special? Ichigo joked. Tosen didn't rise to the snide remark, however, keeping his almost maddeningly cool countenance in the face of combat. I oftentimes enjoy walking out into Hueco Mundo during the sandstorms. It is the one time when I feel that the rest of this world is on the same level playing field as me. Sightless. The same goes for you and I right now. The playing field is level, in more ways than one. Kurosaki Ichigo. Ichigo didn't know what he was talking about, but it didn't matter either. He could talk all he wanted to. The fact of the matter was that Ichigo had one of Aizen's treacherous generals right in front of him, and had the opportunity to take him down. He just had to be able to find him properly in the sandstorm first, as Tosin drifted back and out of Ichigo's clear sight once more. I shouldn't say that things are completely even between us though. Even though I cannot see and you cannot see, what I have over you is experience in this avenue. A thought told Ichigo to turn around, and luckily he did, as instead of being cut in half he was able to block another attack. What instinctive reflexes. You're a remarkable spirit. Getting complimented by a traitor intent on ending life, as everyone knew it was not high on Ichigo's list of great things that could happen to him. But he could barely see 3 feet in front of his face. Sensing where his enemy was happened to be a pretty precise practice when he had his eyes and ears to help, but now he didn't even have that with the storm. The next time Ichigo honed in on the approaching Tosin and they clashed swords, he dug his feet into the sand to keep from sliding away and reached out with one hand to grab onto his collar, getting a good hold of his white uniform. I'm done playing hide-and-seek with you. In his Bankai form, there wasn't anything that Tosin could do in a direct test of strength against him. Are you now? Tosin asked, not seeming to mind that Ichigo had a firm grasp on him. Nake, Suzumushi, cry, cricket. His Zanpakuto began to vibrate fast enough to let out a high-pitched tone that overloaded Ichigo's sense of hearing. It took willpower from the orange-haired teen to remain awake, but he found himself completely disoriented by the sound. With the chance given to him, Tosin shot one leg directly upward between his and Ichigo's clashing swords and kicked the young man in the face under the chin that snapped his head up and back. It took a moment, but Ichigo rocketed his head forward again through the clash of blades with Tosin and headbutted him, knocking the former captain back, rolling through the sands. Yeah, Ichigo shouted, generating black energy to the tip of his Zanpakuto. I'm done playing. Getsuga Tensho, Moonfang Heaven Piercer. Swinging his sword and letting fly with the blast, large portions of the desert were torn up by the attack until it seemingly hit its mark and exploded in a red-trimmed black blast. Eyesight is for pussies. Ichigo shouted over the wind. Ichigo would have rather gotten a shot at Aizen himself, or even Grimmjow. Ikimara would have been preferable too, but he couldn't say that he wasn't disappointed at getting to take on Tosin. Hell, you had to go up the ladder to get to the big boss. If that were the case, he'd run the whole gauntlet if he had to in order to take down the Arrancar army. I wouldn't say all of that. Tosin's voice calmly stated as the noise from the blast drifted off into the howling current of the sandstorm. I should know after all, shouldn't I? He didn't sound injured at all, but then again, with an attack that has such width to it, you didn't need pinpoint aim, did you? As he walked back into sight, his white uniform was just as pristine as ever and his body looked unscathed, but with one grave exception. His entire left arm was missing just above the elbow. The white sands beneath him were stained with the blood spilling from the injury. So how was he talking as if he weren't hurt at all? It didn't matter though. What mattered was that Tosin was now a one-armed man in a sword-swinging contest. You're screwed now, Ichigo said, preparing to put an end to the battle now that his opponent was injured. He wasn't going to let him release his Zanpakuto no matter what he had to do. Dashing forward, Ichigo swung at Tosin only for him to move back in a burst of speed. He was still healthy enough to dodge so smoothly. Reappearing a few feet back, Tosin's Zanpakuto stabbed into the sand and his lone existing hand was up in front of his face, concealing his features from view. I don't think so. You see, all of your power, you merely stumble upon it. Luck into it. That's no justice as far as I'm concerned. I on the other hand have worked tirelessly. I have driven myself toward Aizen-sama's cause, and finally he has gifted me with what you've never deserved. Power transcending that of a Shinigami. As he drew his hand down his face and Ichigo felt a spike of Ryatsu that was a mixture between Shinigami and something else, he couldn't hide the surprise from his face. Because sitting on Tosin's face was a pure white mask covering his entire head and neck, leaving only a hole for his hair to flow out of the back of it. It had a vertical line going down the middle and nothing else. A solid white chest plate with shoulder guards sporting single similar lines to the one on his mask sat on his body. And just like that, with a short extension of his power, Tosin's missing arm grew back, regenerating as if he had never lost it to begin with. Hollow powers! Ichigo cried out in complete surprise. Those weren't visored or Arrancar abilities. They couldn't regenerate on the spot. Only a hollow could do that. What did you dash? How did you dash? What is this? I've already told you. Tosin said, flexing out the newly regrown fingers on his hand experimentally. The powers that you've somehow lucked into I was rewarded with for my service as Aizen-sama's loyal sword. The powers of both a Shinigami and a hollow are in my possession in their entirety, as you can see. Those with a strong enough belief in enforcing justice can make sure it comes through for them. You call what you've done since you left the Soul Society justice? Ichigo asked, quickly getting over his opponent's new powers. People learned how to do new things all the time. All he had to do was adapt and overcome. You killed thousands of souls in the Rukongai. You're about to try and kill an entire city. 100,000 people. For what? To make some self-righteous blowhard a key to God or the Spirit King or whatever the hell you want to call the guy. You really are blind, aren't you? And I'm not even talking about your actual sight. The words of someone that has never seen just what miscarriages of justice are possible in this world of ours. Tosen smoothly picked his Zanpakuto back up and shunpoed out of view without a trace of warning before he wound up right behind Ichigo, sword poised to stab through him. Ichigo didn't even have the time to gasp in surprise at the enhancement to Tosen's physical capabilities. It was like his own hollow mask, only not like it at all. It's like he's moving in a completely different way now. But then again, justice is not something that you can express in words. Instead of the sound of a sword sliding through flesh and organ, the sound of steel hitting steel echoed out. Standing between Tosen and Ichigo was a metal woman with blades for arms and a rather flirty look on her face. Wow. My lucky day. Stuck between two handsome men. I guess this is Koga making it up to me for that thing with the sandworm. Doc? Ichigo said confusedly before remembering that Bawabawa and Koga were still around there somewhere. Tosen said to himself as he found his Zanpakuto in contact with the doll of a Bount instead of the body of a Shinigami. I can't sense your Ryatsu. It's as if you have no Ryoryoku at all. If I were an ordinary blind man you possibly could have stricken out at me with a measure of success. Your master hiding from me is the most intelligent thing I can think of. However, if being a moving shield is the best he can do for Kurosaki. Even if I cannot destroy you, I doubt he is nearly as hard to break. Well, him or your mode of transportation. Ichigo's eyes widened and he felt out for Bawabawa's energy signature, clearly picking it up. The big lug might as well have been a lighthouse on a foggy coast. Your fights with me. Ichigo shouted, swinging at Tosen only to miss. My fight is with any obstacle that stands in the way of Aizen-sama's success. Tosen said before using Shuinpa to get a jump on heading towards Bawabawa. Stranding Ichigo in the desert on foot would be a fitting fate for him, had a number 54, Heian, Way of Destruction number 54, Abolishing Flames. No. As a purple oblong disc of spiritual energy flew from Tosen's hand off where he could sense Bawabawa, Ichigo blurred out of sight while drawing his left hand across his face. Off in the sandstorm the purple light from the Kidu could be seen until it inexplicably split into two separate parts. They flew off in different directions and blew up with the force of blockbuster-level bombs, incinerating everything caught within them into nothing. Not even ash remained. All Tosen did was scoff and hold up his Zanpakuto as if he were expecting something. He was not disappointed when it seemed as if the sandstorm had subsided temporarily. But that simply wasn't the case. It was all a matter of Ichigo's power exploding from his body and redirecting the very sand and wind in the air itself away from him upon its release. If Tosen could see, it would have given him a very clear view of what had changed about Ichigo's appearance to go with the intensity of his Ryatsu. On his face was a white mask with fierce red demonic markings. Through the eyeholes Ichigo's eyes were yellow with black sclera, making for one intimidating stare down that Tosen was getting full force. Now, Ichigo said in his hollow warped voice, Koga, get Doc and Bawabawa and stay out of the way. He'll just try to kill you and call it some kind of justice. I don't need to be any more pissed off than I already am. Once again mocking my ideals of justice? How ignorant. Tosen said, not fazed by the turn of events. In all honesty, he had been expecting Ichigo to break out the hollow powers any second. He'd actually been wondering why he'd been waiting for so long. Trying to save something in the tank for later perhaps. You're just a child, even by the standards of humans. What would you know about the real world? Someone I know said that one person's justice isn't another person's justice. So don't go around and pimp yours like it's the gospel. Ichigo replied, all it is just your own goals and rhetoric. You're wasting your breath spewing that crap at me. As far as I'm concerned, you're just another guy with a self-serving gripe, and that part's actually okay, even if this is how you're trying to pull it all off. If you'd just admit that without hiding behind the justice stuff, I'd probably show you some respect. Ichigo knew a lot of people that he would readily categorize as douche, such as several captains and lieutenants in the Godai 13, or Urahara Kasuke, Haiden, Hirako Shinji and some of the Vizards, and Uzumaki Naruto. But at least they didn't make excuses or act like they were doing the right thing all of the time. Tosen walked around talking about justice and what was right, but could turn right around and be okay with Yami and Grimmjow eradicating an entire city's worth of souls in the Soul Society. Non-combatants all of them. And just so long as he got what he wanted he could try and justify it. At least when the Godii 13 did screwed up things with the Quincy's, the Mod Souls, and the Bounce they didn't try to make themselves out to be the good guys. There weren't good guys in most of these things. There was just the offending side or the offended side. Pick one and deal with it. All Ichigo wanted was to make sure the people close to him didn't have to pay for being on one of those sides. That was it. One by one, all of the conspirators that had started all of this were going to have to fall for this to end. If he had to start with Tosen Kaname, so be it. Hollow powers or not, former Shinigami captain or not, it didn't matter. XXX. With Naruto's group. As one with the desert so to speak, Gaara could feel anything that he truly endeavored to reach out and locate in Hueco Mundo. If he wanted to find something, there was absolutely nothing that could hide from him as long as it was in contact with sand. A temporary stop within close proximity to one of multiple little outpost buildings a short distance away from Las Noches allowed for Gaara to sense through the sand. It was then that he felt Ichigo's energy far, far away and in conflict with another powerful source. Captain level, and it wasn't even at its limit yet. Ichigo was using his mask already. A hand rested on Gaara's shoulder, turning out to be Naruto's. What do you got? Ichigo is here and is fighting one of the Shinigami defectors. Koga is with him. He could feel just how hard Naruto hit his face by palming it. Obviously he was not pleased. Shall we abort the mission? No. Naruto said, thinking things over. Wonder Boy knows the drill. We can't treat him like he's 10 and powerless. You know what they say about the next generation and all that. He could probably take on any of them. Being gifted with the powers of death gods and the monsters that are their sworn enemies would do that for someone. The only reason I didn't take him with us in the first place was because I wanted him back in Karakura town in case something happened there again. Ichigo could take care of himself. He'd thrown that kid to the wolves in the training with Shinji and the others, and even though Ichigo would still spend random minutes of time every so often, just staring at Naruto as if he were pondering ways to enact some sort of vengeance, it didn't change the fact that if Ichigo had been a bad man beforehand he was even more so now. So yes, he'd be fine barring some sort of catastrophic shitstorm occurrence, but those usually came one at a time. Naruto hadn't filled his own quota for messed up things happening to him at inopportune times for the decade yet, thus he was feeling that it would happen to his merry little band before anything else. 2 hours is enough time to wait. Gaara said, standing up from where he had been sticking his arm in the sand. I elect we continue. The structure is too vast for me to get a good feel of what to expect from attacking it without a closer look. Fine. Naruto said, heading back into the temporarily commandeered outpost building. Kensei was sitting in the corner resting his eyes. Tatsuki was sawing logs on the floor using her own arms as a pillow. Neliel was just staring out the window at Hueco Mundo. It's about time to get going again. This time we're not stopping until we get to Las Noches. I won't go any farther. Nell said, never taking her eyes off of the stronghold of those that she used to call her allies. I told you that I would guide you to Las Noches, but this is closer than I had ever intended to go. Fair enough. Naruto wasn't in the business of trying to forcefully recruit someone that wasn't interested, except for Haiden. But that was different. Nell had wound up in the human world due to an oversight on his part, and she had never been intended to fight. If she wanted to stay out of it all and remain neutral, good luck to her. Kensei was awake enough to hear all of that and let out a scoff before standing up and walking out to stretch his muscles back out. If the girl didn't want to get involved, that was her business. He definitely didn't need her around if she wasn't going to contribute. Ass. Naruto muttered as Kensei moved past him, getting flipped off over the man's shoulder for his trouble. That aside, he turned his attention back to Nell as he got down to gently rouse Tatsuki. What are you going to do then if you're not going any further? I'm returning to the human world with you once you're finished to get my Jigai and my fraction from Kisuke-san. Nell admitted, from there we'll probably never cross paths again. That's the hope at least. Until that point I suppose this is as good a place as any to wait. She put on a small smile despite herself when Naruto rolled Tatsuki over in his bid to wake her up and wound up getting punched in the face. You sure? Naruto asked once more as he rubbed at his jaw where Tatsuki had hit him. You don't want to go back just one more time for old time's sake? There's no reason. Nell said with a shake of her head before turning her attention to Tatsuki, who was still completely out of it. She's a very special human girl, but that's still just all she is though, human. This isn't the kind of situation she should be placed in. It was her choice. She didn't want to be the only one of her friends left out. Naruto explained, still trying to wake the stubborn girl up. Did she usually sleep that hard when she got home after training? This was absurd, and what are you talking about? I'm human. Chad and Orihime are human. Yuri is human. That's an entirely different thing altogether. From what I've learned, exposure to the Hugyoku in Kuchiki Rukia's body and the unstable Ryatsu from Kurosaki Ichigo's body led to the manifestation of their powers, all except Ishida Yuri's of course. Nell pointed to Tatsuki for emphasis, but her. She's got none of that. If it weren't for what you've had her do she'd be nothing like them. Naruto opened his mouth to defend Tatsuki's potential and say that she'd grown in leaps and bounds in mere months with no end to it in sight, but then he contemplated what Nell had just gotten through saying. With that he thought things through quite thoroughly before speaking again. You want to know why she didn't manifest powers like the rest of them? He said, stroking Tatsuki's hair carefully. You know why? Nell asked with a tilt of her head. Naruto nodded, idly continuing to lavish attention on his student. Before any of this ever started she trained herself in the martial arts hard. Every day she trained since she was a little girl. She's technically better than most people I've ever seen when it comes to hand. Her physical energies were already monstrously high. Then hanging around with Ichigo's Ryatsu spilling out all of the time like a gas leak pumped up her spiritual energy. That doesn't explain anything yet. Naruto smiled and clasped both of his hands together. That's chakra. Physical and spiritual energies combined in the body. Ki and Ryuryoku. Nell was still lost but listened anyway as Naruto stroked Tatsuki's hair again. Everyone else's spiritual energy got jacked up so high as opposed to what their ki had been that it warped something in them. Even for Chad. He was strong, but that was all natural. When it came to her, the boost of Ryuryoku just extended to match her ki since it had already been so huge. Both were just about even, sky high, and that's what gave her such badass reserves. As far as Naruto wasn't concerned, Tatsuki wasn't just special. She wasn't just one in a million. She was more than that. She was more than once in a lifetime, she was once in his lifetime, and that was saying something. He hadn't felt anyone with chakra like hers since the age of ninjas ended in the ultimate bang with him as the last man standing. Sure, there had been some with a bit of a spark. But this was something special. For all intents and purposes she was a goddamned national treasure. And her potential was boundless. If there is nothing else I know how to do as a teacher, Naruto started to say, looking up and staring Nellil dead in the eyes, I know how to take what you're good at and work it until it covers everything else that you could be bad at. She seems like she'd suck at illusions, and that's fine because I do too. So why go there? Screw it. By the time we're done she's going to be the baddest ninjutsu specialist in the world behind yours truly. I'm talking a jutsu to match any Shinigami's Kidu, taijutsu that can bust even an Espada's Hierro. She'll be the strongest ninja in millennia. At this point he was standing up, fists clenched tightly and the presence of his own power radiating off of his body like heat from a furnace. On the floor, Tatsuki had been awake since Naruto had been talking about chakra, and her cheeks couldn't have been any redder from embarrassment. But if she doesn't wake her cute little ass up so we can keep going I'm going to bust it when we get back to base. Running through the desert world of the hollows followed by a training session that would better be described as punishment? The prospect of that got Tatsuki to jump up to her feet and stand at attention. That's better. Did you sleep well? No. It's a floor. Tatsuki groused, eyes searching the ground so that she didn't have to meet those of her sensei. So when we get there, what do you want me to do, Naruto-sensei? I want you to watch and pay attention. That's all. Naruto said with a shrug, I'm not going to force you to do something I don't think you're ready for. Right, like picking a fight with a Shinigami lieutenant? And no matter what you're never to be by yourself. Unless you have any complaints? No. This mission had given her enough tests to let her know where she stood. Fighting an emotionally unstable lieutenant and running for longer than any other human being could bear without their heart bursting in hostile territory was more than plenty. Complaints weren't the problem. The problem was the movement of Gaara's and Kensei's energy signatures away from the safe house. Gaara would never let that happen, unless he sensed something close and felt the need to intervene before whatever it was found them. But someone like Gaara could. And Naruto felt his energy move away from being just outside with Kensei going along with him. Taking a deep breath he began to take in the latent energy around him to reach out and more accurately feel what was going on around him. Upon doing so he could readily acknowledge that the plans had just changed. Observing and reporting on Lost No Chase and its potential weak points was not the priority any longer. This is worse than trying to get into the Seriidii and fight the Godii 13. Naruto thought to himself before getting fed up with his enemy seeming to have the drop on his side all the time. With a growl to himself, Naruto walked outside with purpose in his eyes that turned Rinnegan in appearance as he walked up a rather tall sand dune to get a good view of Hueco Mundo still miles away. Okay. Plan B. Going outside to follow him, Nell and Tatsuki stood behind Naruto to watch what he was going to do. Nell raised an eyebrow at the visible flaring of Naruto's chakra, until it started to turn dark in color instead of blue. After a moment of observing he seemed to think better of it and went back to normal before Nell herself could reach out and stop him. What are you doing? I was going to pull some extra power to do something, but I can't level that thing from the outside. Naruto said to himself despite the fact that he was heard, it's the size of a whole city-state, and it's reinforced. I doubt it's seki like the Seriidii, but that's not the point. The meteorite technique can't summon anything big enough to smoke that place in one move with the roof there to take the impact first. A meteor? Nell couldn't keep the surprise off of her face and Tatsuki fell to her knees in the sand out of pure shock and awe. Naruto didn't lie, especially to her. If he said that he absolutely meant it. Meteorite actually. Sorry. It wouldn't take the whole thing since it's still the size of a city and it's covered entirely. But if my aim was on I could land it right through the center of that roof where those towers are sticking out. That'd still probably kill anything that got caught underneath, or anything in the towers, but anyone that was actually strong would survive. The drain of chakra simply was not worth it if it wasn't going to do anything important. Adding on to the fact that he'd have to use a major chunk of it from the Jubi's supply to get the potency of his chakra strong enough to attract a meteorite to begin with. And for his real big gun jutsu he'd definitely be poking the sleeping Jubi Sasuke right in the eye with a pointy stick. He hadn't had to pull a Baijidama since the last time he'd fought him. You say that as if it's any less ludicrous. You're a human. That's a power reserved more for a Shinigami captain's Bankai, or a top-level Espada's Resurrección. Whatever you say. Naruto said with a roll of his Rinnegan eyes. If she really wanted to keep thinking that way she could. He didn't have anything to prove to her. I'm not Chris Angel, here to mind freak you for my own amusement. Why haven't you shown that kind of destructive power sooner then? Nell would acknowledge that Naruto was powerful in combat, but not like that from what she'd seen in her child form. The things he spoke of were absurd by any creature's standards of possibility. When would I have justified doing anything like that? Using a Raisin Shuriken in Karakura town was stupid enough by itself, and that's not even the most destructive jutsu I've got. Arguing over just what a human being was capable of doing against was not his idea of being productive. I'd shoot a Baijidama at Lost No Chase just to show you up, but I don't want to risk waking up the killer world-ending demon in my belly without a damn good reason for it. Blowing away half of the entire exterior fortress wall would have had her jaw hitting the sand quite solidly. But it wouldn't kill Aizen or bring the fortress down in its entirety, so it wasn't worth it. The argument would have continued had they not been joined in progress by someone that they were both familiar with to a varying extent. The moment they felt the movement nearby they turned out and stared to the figure standing out on the sand just observing them. Calculating green eyes stared out over the elevated collar of her quite revealing Arrancar uniform jacket. Oh. Naruto said, bringing his dispute over his capabilities with Nell to an end. Well, if it isn't the new princess of the Arrancar army. He said with his arms crossed over his chest, I made a mistake. I felt Gaara going to someone that was trying to hide a lot of power and thought it might have been you. You were indeed mistaken. Harabel said, looking over to Neliel, so you have chosen to side with them. No. I'm with no one. I'm simply repaying a debt by showing them to Lost No Chase. Nell said levelly, a debt that has been paid. I'm not going any farther and I'm not fighting no matter what. I refuse to participate in something like this. There's no reason for it. I'm afraid Aizen-sama was quite clear with what he needed from you. Harabel seemed to say with some regret in her voice, refusing to fight was fine. But now you're assisting the enemy. There is no happy medium to be had here. It was either stand with him or stand against him. He created her more or less, and could not risk her power falling into the hands of anyone else, even if she was intent on staying out. So it seemed as if they were at an impasse again. Nell wouldn't fight, but she was now assisting the enemy. Harabel didn't want to fight, but she had her duties and Nell was a security risk. Naruto had no problems with Harabel, but he was not about to let her attack someone that he was working a deal with, especially since Nell would not fight back unless it was absolutely necessary. Harabelle's eyes turned toward Naruto as she seemed to stare him down, observing him and analyzing everything she could see and sense. His energy was fluctuating wildly, wilder than it had been when they had first met. Something was making his power unstable, something that hadn't been a factor during their first run-in. She then looked upon the human girl that was there with him, behind him on her knees in the sand, probably feeling like a child in a room full of towering adults. And just like that, Tatsuki felt herself beginning to be crushed under the spiritual force of her Ryatsu. It was as if the air were being stolen from her very lungs. "Hey!" Naruto snapped, suddenly breaking the effect of the psychological warfare on his apprentice. "I didn't think someone like you would try to bully someone that much weaker than you that didn't want to fight. If you want to force your will on somebody, aim it at me. I'm the reason Nell's here." "Very well then," she said, shutting her eyes before reaching for the sword on her back, but before she could draw it, Naruto was already directly in her face with a fist drawn back that rocketed forward to strike her. "Don't insult me." With Sonito she avoided Naruto's punch. Or she thought she did, because upon moving Naruto kept pace right with her, an orange pigment at the edge of his eyes to signify something special. Sage Mode and Rinnegan to help him anticipate her movements with her Ryoryoka trail, and swift release to keep pace with the moves as best as he could. Keeping up with her Sonito wasn't an issue here. "I'm not playing games with you," he said before landing a punch straight to the chest that sent her flying back and obliterating a sand dune with her body. Looking down at his hand, Naruto noted that it had bloody scrapes on it as if he had been rubbing his fist against a brick. "That Hierro is no joke. I've never punched an espada before." Ichigo reported breaking his hand punching Yami in the face the other day, and he was just the 10th espada. Soifan had to work quite hard just to wound Grimmjow and he was the 6th. So what was he going to have to do to damage the 3rd? "I already told you not to insult me," Harabelle said as she got up looking absolutely no worse for wear following the hit she had taken. "The gap between an espada and another of a lower number is vast. Defeating Sail Aporo Grands means nothing when it comes to fighting me." Using the advantages given by fighting inside of our fortress, he was barely ranked number 8. Outside of Las Noches he could hardly be considered an espada to begin with. Naruto had kind of figured that when it had barely taken one move to defeat him. "I'm disappointed in you if that is what you're willing to put up against me to show," Harabelle said, her sword drawn and hanging from her hand at her side. "I had hoped that you would be willing to show me just what you meant when we had first met in the forest of Minos. I'd rather not have to show you just what sacrifice really is supposed to be," Naruto said before taking a deep breath. "I don't think I can like this. But you're not going to back off either. So I guess fighting you is all I can do." Naruto looked over at Nell and shot a quick glance to Tatsuki, letting her know that she was to make sure that she was a safe distance away if Nell wasn't going to help him. By the time he turned back to Harabelle he had already heard the telltale sound of Sonito moving past him. Nell was already gone and so was Tatsuki. Harabelle attacked him head-on and tried to overwhelm him with her Zanpakuto. Naruto didn't even bother trying to waste time drawing the Raijin no Ken and instead focused on avoiding her attacks. She had a high level of skill with a sword, and any lapse in his concentration would probably end with him bleeding on the ground somehow. Deciding to create an opening, Naruto ducked low and spun in a 360-degree turn with his leg extended for a sweep that Harabelle avoided by flying. The length of the attack, however, extended 15 yards away from the tip of his shoe, creating a wide circle around his entire body. That would have landed even if she'd managed to move back, and taking to the air was the only option she had available to her. She had to admit that she'd never thought of such a thing. "He doesn't have to touch me to actually land a blow against me." Sure, it might have been 15 yards or so this time, but she'd estimate that he could control just how far and wide his physical attacks could extend on any given move he made. "You control your power so well," Naruto said to her now that they were alone. "It'd be hard to believe that you were the 3rd strongest espada if I didn't know full well that you can't judge a book by its cover." As if responding to what he'd just said, she unleashed an overwhelming amount of spiritual power. A blinding yellow surrounded her, bright and strong enough that he wouldn't have doubted that she could be seen from miles away. That was more like it. And she wasn't using her resurrection yet. "You haven't even begun to see the extent of my power. I think, for once, I'm going to have to say screw it about the whole Jubi thing and be irresponsible. Because if he died due to pulling his punches against an awesome opponent here he'd wind up dooming everything anyway."